guys, thanks for joining me today. My name is Isaac Eicher, and today's video lesson is going to be about shifting positions on the mandolin neck and the different shapes that I think about to accomplish these moves that I've developed over the years. To me, this is something that really characterizes my playing. I think that oftentimes players develop their own moves, but everybody does something different, and I'm really excited to share this topic with you guys and show you some of the secrets and some of the moves that I do. The first thing we're going to look at is thinking about these different shapes on the mandolin neck, and we're going to start with your first finger, where that would be on the root. And then in subsequent chapters, we're going to look at when the other fingers are starting out on the root of whatever key you're in. For the purposes of building this one finger at a time, I'd like to start on first finger. So my first idea for a shape or a position would be when your first finger is on the root. So in fact, when you're playing in the key of G, for instance, that doesn't occur. So you would have to go to another key. Let's look at the key of A. So when I play an A scale, my first finger is on the root. And so what that means is there is an implied roll for all of your fingers. So normally when you play an A scale in first position, the corresponding fingers will be first, second, third. In this case, open, because we are in first position. And then the subsequent fingers. Basically the same thing on the D string. So moving up the neck, you have to keep in mind that we will end up using our fourth finger. So if I were going to pretend that we were somewhere where I can't use those open strings, if we were further up the neck, then it would be just all, I'd have my little finger there too. When you think about a shape like this, for me, what it means or what it implies is that if I land with my first finger on A, that means that I know I'm going to end up using what I have available to me would be my third finger is obviously, the same notes of the scale. If you're looking at arpeggio notes, that means that my third finger is on the major third, my first finger is also on the fifth, and my third finger again is on the major seven, and then I have the octave up here. And so from that, I can really just as a shape, thinking of A or maybe even, E, any of these arpeggio notes really as anchor notes, notes that I know I can land on or that I can go to start out a lick, and just an idea of a lick. For instance. Actually, I played it differently there at that time. So another idea would be anything that I do with this, the important thing to keep in mind is I can play whatever I want, but I'm staying in this position. So whatever my vocabulary is, the licks that I develop out of this position, I know I could use those, for instance, here. And so we're not going to be limited to just having, stopping at the octave, like I went up to C sharp there. So that is our first position. We are in first position because our first finger is on one of these first two frets. But I'm thinking of this as our first idea of a position that could be anywhere. It could be here, but we're not going to call it fourth position, although that's technically what it is. I'm just thinking of this as this is when my first finger is on the root. Now let's look at when your second finger is on the root. If you played a G scale in first position, well, if you follow that, here's a perfect example of when you have your second finger on the root. You have, in the same way that we were using the other example in A with your first finger on the root, you have licks and vocabulary that are associated with this position. If you're playing a tune or a lick or a phrase where you're not moving out of this position, the idea here is to recognize that where you are and what the other notes are that are available to you when you're in this position and you're not looking to move and change out of the position. So you have inherently, you develop a vocabulary based on this position and based on where the other fingers are going to fall. So another way to think about this is how common double stops work on the mandolin. For instance, playing B with your first finger and G, the root, with your second finger. Or this double stop, a D with my third finger and a G with my second finger. Well, if we're thinking about staying in this position, and maybe I'll move down to other strings, I mean, that also implies this is the same position where my third finger is on the root here and my first finger is on the major third. And then that would also mean, later on, we'll look at this more as we talk about focusing on the third finger, but being on the root. But for now, if we're just looking at this, I think thinking about those double stops can really help, because it helps you identify, in the same way that if you think about a chord, if you just think about whatever your concept is for that position and what that implies and what that inherently means, is that we're going to use our third finger on D. And so if I have a vocabulary of licks, so I'll play some licks slower. And actually there I use my fourth finger to reach for that B note. So whatever it is your vocabulary is and the licks that you develop, what I'm trying to get across is that you recognize that we can stay here, and that basically there's an implicit role that all of your fingers are going to take, the notes that are available and fit that position, that you would use those fingers to play. Now we're going to talk about when your third finger is on the root, and that as a position, or the different notes that are associated out of that position. And we saw a little bit of this when we were talking about how in first position, when you're playing in the key of G, you have your second finger on the root. So when you play the scale further down, really what you're going to see is this overlap between shapes. For instance, here, the idea would be that I know that when my third finger is on the root, that I have a certain vocabulary that I can play within this position. In the same way that when our first finger was on the root here, I kind of recognize that I have my octave here. Well, here, third finger's on the root, and second finger is also on the root. So with this though, let's say that if I were playing in the key of D, for instance, then I don't have a higher string to play that octave with my second finger anymore. So now let's focus on the key of D, because this is really the point that I want to make with this position where your third finger is on the root. So this would imply a set of, whatever your vocabulary is and the licks and the phrasing that you have, it's still important to recognize that this is a position that's extremely essential to playing, basically any type of music on the mandolin. These, we're just talking about really the roles of these three, your first three fingers being the fingers that you're going to use the most. To me, the fourth finger is very useful. I've learned plenty of tunes and licks, and my style of playing really includes the fourth finger. However, I don't focus on it as it's not a strong finger. It's weaker inherently than the other fingers. So I just use it more to reach for notes. So if we were in the key of D, you have certain, what this implies is that my first finger can be on B, my third finger will be on G, for instance, or my second finger will be on F sharp. So now, momentarily, we're going to talk about connecting these shapes. Something I want to point out, though, is that we talked about playing in the key of G earlier, but let's make this harder. If we were in the key of A flat, would you think that the first option would be to technically stay in what would be, well, I guess first position, so having our fourth finger on A flat? To me, this can occur, but it's if I'm starting a lick on or a phrase on A flat, if I'm playing like an A flat scale, I'm going to do this if I'm starting down here. I will use my fourth finger, but practically speaking, when I'm playing a tune that's in A flat, I'm not just reciting the A flat scale. Maybe I'll play this arpeggio that we looked at earlier, but for me, I find it much more comfortable to go ahead and shift up, and we're going to talk about moves that you can do like that. But now what I want to point out, that with my third finger, which is a stronger finger than my fourth finger, when that's on A flat, see how I can play the same ideas being in closed position that I play when I'm in G here. And the same is true for when I'm playing in A. You can move this shape up all day. I mean, as far as you want to take it. And see, for me, I would shift. I've developed these moves, or I would already want to shift if I want to play something different. But my point is that this is a position that's going to occur in every key. And that's why it's important to identify what it is, because we're getting ready to look at how that's going to come up in different keys. Now we're going to look at some specific moves where you're actually shifting from one position to another. And we're going to start out with probably the first move that I learned, or one of the first moves that I really integrated into my playing and has helped define my style. So now we're going to talk about actually shifting. And the finger, or let's say the move that I always like to introduce first, is something that I learned first, my first trick for getting out of first position. So we're going to be talking about the key of D right now. For me, it's a common move, but I think it's also maybe somewhat common for different styles, because in the key of D, you don't have an upper octave. This is your highest D note in first position. So you want to be able to play this D note for many reasons. So we're going to talk about shifting with your third finger, and I'm going to explain various ways that you can do this. You can do this all over the mandolin neck, but we're really going to be focusing on that technique and the different ideas that you can do. So if you think about where we are, our starting place, we're in first position. So with this idea, our third finger is on the root. But as a tool to access higher notes, because we could also play these notes up here, but the idea of shifting up here is going to allow me to access these notes in a different way, and probably an easier, more fluid way. So the first move is going to be when your first finger, or third finger, is on D, and I'm going to slide up all the way to an F sharp. And for my lick, because I want to have something to help to execute after I make the move, so that's going to be now. If I truly, so I shifted up, but I didn't even access, or I didn't even go for these notes up here. So the move is what I want you to really get out of this, because at the end of the day, you can play any lick here, but the move that takes me to third position, see, the reason why I think it's the way it ends up working out is that the move in itself, the shifting position to third position, but using D to an F sharp, see, those are notes that you would want to play anyway. So in a way, that shift, that position shift, is defining what the notes are in the lick. And so the lick inherently includes that. But see, by the time you get up to this F sharp, you could play whatever you want, but I'm really playing it as one idea. Now, what are some other examples? Maybe I'll take my third finger, and instead of going all the way up to third position, and so when you recognize that you're in third position, now that was the first position that we talked about when my first finger is on the root. So those are the two positions that we've connected. Now, another example would be if I go up here and see I slid my third finger up to an E, and what that does is it puts me in this position where my second finger is on the root. So now what can you play there? I mean, it just comes down to whatever your vocabulary is, whatever licks that you decide to execute. And actually, I'm not going to get ahead of myself because I just shifted down. But what I want you to recognize is that this chord, this common mandolin chord, is what we opened ourselves up to. Because if you're just playing in D, but see now I'm playing F sharp on the D string, which would normally be my second finger. But for me, that's just as normal to play that note with my first finger because I'm out of this position. And we'll talk about this later, but I can also shift there to get back to third position again. So some other examples would be, what if I play, talking about shifting with my third finger, if I'm in D, what if I don't shift on the A string, but I go up here? And see, with this type of move, you can continue to shift. You can go. And what is this? That's the same thing as down here, because my third finger is on D, my second finger is on D there. Now, I think it's important to look at different keys to see why, to start making connections to how these positions or these shifts can occur in different parts of the mandolin neck. So I've chosen A flat because that is the flat 5. I guess it's in some ways the polar opposite of D. But when we talked about this right here, we were in this position, third finger on the root, and then first finger on the root. We're going to do something basically the opposite. So if I'm down here on my first finger on A flat on the G string, that's the same as when, if you'll remember, we're basically doing the opposite. We're starting with my first finger on the root, and then I'm going to put my third finger on the root here. And here in a second, we're going to talk about shifting down with my second finger. But do you see how I've connected in two almost polar opposite keys? I've used the same, not quite the same shift, because this one is just going up from that major 7 to that, but those are the same positions where my first finger is on the root, and then now I've shifted so my third finger is on the root. Now we're going to focus on our second finger and different moves we can use to shift up or shift down from one position to another. Honestly, when I'm doing these things, I've just developed them into my vocabulary. Really, they become part of a bigger move, but I think it's important to focus on these specific moves and really get those that into your understanding of what's happening, and then you can just use it more fluidly in the future. For instance, here's one. So we were talking about when you're in the D and then you go to D here. Well, a common move that I'm going to do is use my second finger down to get back to this position, where now my second finger is on the root there. So if I'm in third position, so I've used 2 now. I want to back up. I want to make sure we get this. So we've got, do you see how this, when I know I'm in third position here, that really implies that I also have this double stop and that as a reference point. So, but I'm going to do a move now to get here. So now that my second finger, I'll be shifting down. And I want to point out, basically this going back and forth between third position and second position. Third position, well, what would technically be third position and second position, but when you think about it this way, that's the position when your first finger's on the root, and this is the position when your second finger's on the root. So there, I did it again. So we've got here. Now watch this. So we have the first one. Now here's another one. And I actually used another one earlier. I'm going to show that now. So I'm sliding from D to C sharp. So here we've got one that's sliding from A to G, and that gets me ready to be in this position. Now I'm here. I want to keep moving, so I'm going to go, maybe I want to go get down to first position. I'm going to do this. So I've got my second finger would be on C sharp, and I'm using my second finger to slide to B. Now, another one that we did would be, so this move, so I've started out with in this position and where my second finger is on the root. And there I'm sliding back with my second finger. The interesting thing, I think that for some reason, it's much easier for me to use my second finger to slide down than, for instance, using my third finger to slide down. I never do that, but I always, very frequently, use my second finger to slide down. And occasionally, I'll use my second finger to slide up. But before I talk about that, I want to show you an exercise where, let's say that I'm on A here. So I've got my second finger on the root here. So with that pattern, basically I can do it anywhere on the neck. Actually, there I wanted to use my first finger. So let's say here, I'm using my second finger every time to slide down to the next note in the D scale. Try that out. And when you get that under your fingers, it becomes much easier to throw in one of those slides to connect to whatever it is you're going for. But see, what I've developed is now that I want to use my first finger as well, because I've found that easier in certain positions. Now let's look at when you go, occasionally I will take my second finger and slide up. So one instance might be, so I'm using this double stop where my first finger is on D, and now I'm going to play a lick. It's not completely necessary. I mean, I'm doing it because it sounds a certain way. It's more of an aesthetic reason. Other ways I might use that, sliding up with my second finger, there's this move where I'm really not shifting, but I'm just kind of sliding and for an effect. There it was even more dramatic because I'm doing it for a whole step. So that can be a cool sound, although I'm not really doing it to shift to a new position because I'm not staying there. I'm just getting a sound out of it.